Um, this is going to be a solo episode. I'm going to talk a bit about the war in Gaza, do some kind of sit rep. It's not something I've done on this channel before, and I am doing it now because I have wanted to listen to this type of sit rep on the war for the past 82 days, and I have not had exactly what I wanted. I wanted an analyst who had a lot of knowledge of guerrilla warfare, which there are some. I wanted an analyst who had a lot of knowledge of modern contemporary warfare and weapon systems, of which there are quite a few that I follow, but many of those don't have. I didn't want someone who underrated basically Arab military abilities, and specifically Palestinian and Lebanese and now Yemeni military capacities, because the majority of analysts that I do follow are very dismissive of these and of guerrilla war in general. So finding someone who is not dismissive, who understands guerrilla warfare, and also who has a sense of the moral dimension of this conflict. Somebody like Norman Finkelstein, who I think really does have a sense of the moral dimension of the conflict, but I think he's admittedly, like in his own words, rather dismissive of the military capacities of, I guess, the Palestinian fighting organizations. So for that reason, the only people that are that match exactly what I am looking for on the web are, of course, Electronic Intifada's live streams and John Elmer. He's my friend. You've already seen him on this channel, and you'll see him again on this channel. That's twice a week, and every once in a while, I finish listening to that, and then I don't have anything to go on. So I've decided that I'm gonna try to make the video that I would want to see, or that I would want to listen to about this. So with those kinds of motivations in mind, you can understand what it is that I'm trying to do here. And before I jump into the specifics of Gaza on day 82, I want to talk a little bit about the parallel that keeps coming to mind and keeps coming up in this channel, which is the Vietnamese war against the American invasion. And I think while the Financial Times, I believe, did a story on it more than a month ago, comparing the Palestinian resistance to the National Liberation Front in Vietnam. And several, you've probably seen several videos since then about the importance of a tunnel network and the importance of, the way that a people's war proceeds, the way that you can be winning as a guerrilla force in a guerrilla conflict, even though the civilian destruction and casualties are absolutely horrific. With Vietnam, we still don't know, apparently, whether the exact number of Vietnamese who were killed, between 2 to 5 million Vietnamese people were killed during the Vietnam War, during the US war against Vietnam. And the Vietnamese won that war, nevertheless. And again, Chomsky, who is always one of my reference points, argued that Vietnam didn't win that war. He argued that by destroying so much of Vietnam, the US set the precedent and showed third world countries how much suffering they would have to go through to achieve liberation. But I think, again, that's a little bit like I would arguer with Finkelstein, and I think Finkelstein, like me, is somebody who follows Chomsky closely, and maybe even like me, arguably built a lot of their views and analysis around Chomsky's. I think that both Finkelstein and Chomsky are a little bit, I don't know, defeatist or despairing about third world military capacities. And in both cases, I think it's part of their understanding of the role of a dissident in the West, which is to focus on the crimes of the Western governments that one's taxes fund and one's own government participates in. But I'm not exactly doing this as a dissenter, although, of course, that's part of what I do. What I mostly want to do in these videos, to the extent that if I continue to do them, is just to understand what's going on for my own sake, which I go through a process more or less every day of trying to understand what's going on with this war. I spend a good portion of my day trying to understand what's going on in this war, and I figure I might as well not do that alone. I might as well come out here and figure it out with you all as well. So the underutilized source, now I'm ready to get to, is Vo Nguyen Gap, general in the Vietnamese, National Liberation Front, General Giap, and he wrote several books or things. His thoughts and concepts are codified in several books, and the one that I've been reading is People's War, People's Army. And there's some incredible quotes here that are so so important and so long lasting, right? So let me just read you a couple. The War of Liberation of the Vietnamese people was a long and vast guerrilla war, proceeding from simple to complex, then to mobile war in the last years of the resistance. Guerrilla war is the war of the broad masses of an economically backward country standing up against a powerfully equipped and well-trained army of aggression. Is the enemy strong? One avoids him. Is he weak? One attacks him. To his modern armament, one opposes a boundless heroism to vanquish either by harassing or by annihilating the enemy according to circumstances, and by combining military operations with political and economic action. No fixed line of demarcation, the front being wherever the enemy is found. The front being wherever the enemy is found. So this is very interesting. So in terms of how I follow day-to-day events in the war, there are two channels that are particularly important. They're both on Twitter, and I'll try to show you them. Try to pull them up for you. This is a map of Gaza that I'm going to get back to, but the two channels that I wanted to show you were, one, Ibn Riyad's channel, IBNRIAD, and two, Aria, ARYJEAY. And Aria's channel, Aria posts daily summaries. So each of the resistance groups publish summaries of what they've done, and Aria posts summaries of them each night. So just to give you a sense of what Al-Qassam Brigades, which is the Hamas's armed wing, and the Al-Quds Brigade is the Islamic Jihad armed wing. So these are political parties, and then they have an armed wing. Hamas is the political party. Al-Qassam is the armed wing. So this is a list of what Al-Qassam Brigades did on December 27th. Number one, targeted a special Israeli special forces in a building in Jabalia, okay, using an RPO, a Shmel thermobaric weapon, killing and injury of all soldiers inside. Clashed with IOF, they call them the IOF. Israel calls them the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. I believe the IOF is the resistance groups call it the Israeli occupation forces in the Sufa area north of Gaza City for 6 hours straight, using machine guns, Yasin 105s, anti-armor explosives, and thermobaric grenades, targeted 2 IDF or IOF helicopters with an anti-aircraft missile, surface-to-air missile north of Gaza City, partially destroyed 4 Merkava tanks, 1 APC, 5 military bulldozers, and 7 military vehicles in various battle zones in the Strip, shelled military gatherings. Let's keep going because there are a number of resistance factions. Qassam is one and Al-Quds is the other. These are the 2 big ones. There are other ones, and this list includes all of them. But just to continue here, Al-Quds brigades shelled Nahal Oz, which is one of the Israeli cities in the so-called Gaza envelope, where some of the battles happened on October 7th, completely destroyed a Merkava tank with an explosive device east of Burej camp in central Gaza, downed a drone in Gaza City, in the sky of Gaza City, destroyed 3 military vehicles in the Tufa and Sheikh Radwan axes in Gaza City, clashed with a Zionist force in the axis in Khan Yunis. So just to show you a map here of what we're talking about. Jabalia, Beit Lahia, this is Gaza City, and Khan Yunis is here. So there's fighting in Gaza City. You may remember if you've been following the war all along, this is what's called North Gaza, this big sign that says Gaza. And then Rafah is the very south on the border with Egypt. And then Khan Yunis is closer to the south. It's the big city of the south, closer to the south than the north. There's Al Burej. So there's fighting going on all over, but quite a lot of it is going on in northern Gaza. So the Israelis told Palestinians to leave northern Gaza. Many of them did leave northern Gaza. They are continuing to bomb wherever the Palestinian population went, which is to say they're bombing them in Khan Yunis and now in Rafah. So the Palestinian civilians have left for the most part. But the fighting between the Palestinian resistance groups and the Israeli army continues to happen in the north, in these areas that the Palestinians have left. So there's a lot of consequences that follow from that. One is the Israeli Air Force is focusing on bombing civilians because the bombing continues to follow where the civilians go, not where the battles with the Palestinian resistance take place. Another consequence is that there is, exactly as General Giap said, there's the battle front being, there's no fixed line of demarcation, the front being wherever the enemy is found. Here's another few notes I want to make on Giap, People's War, People's Army. Another long quote, sorry. Concentration of troops to realize an overwhelming superiority over the enemy where he is sufficiently exposed in order to destroy his manpower. Initiative, suppleness, rapidity, surprise, suddenness in attack and retreat. So if you go on those 2 channels that I've recommended for following what's going on, Ibn Riyad and REGA, you'll see they post the videos that are produced by Palestinian resistance guerrilla or fighters of them attacking mechanized or these armored vehicles. The list that I read to you, that there are videos of many of these attacks that are listed in that summary, and it's exactly as Gia describes it. It's initiative, it's rapidity, it's surprise, it's suddenness in attack and retreat. As long as the strategic, I'm going to continue the quote. As long as the strategic balance of forces remains disadvantageous, resolutely to muster troops to obtain absolute superiority in combat at a given place at a given time. And that can just mean what you see in the videos, one or two soldiers or one or two guerrillas attacking a single armored vehicle. That is, if you have the element of surprise, that is local superiority. And to exhaust little by little small victories the enemy forces, exactly, again, the strategy that's unfolding, and at the same time to maintain and increase ours. In these concrete conditions, it proves absolutely necessary not to lose sight of the main objective of the fighting, and that is the destruction of the enemy manpower. Therefore, losses must be avoided even at the cost of losing ground, and that for the purposes of recovering later on the occupied territories and completely liberating the country. So this is important because early on, when the Israeli army entered the Gaza Strip, there was some defeatism. There were some defeatist analyses that are saying, look, they've lost territory. And of course, Israel makes a lot out of the fact that they've lost, that they plant the flag in Gaza Square and on the beaches and so on. But General Giap says you concede territory for the purposes of recovering the occupied territories later on. You avoid losses even at the cost of losing ground. So another thing that he says a little bit later is how the weapons are acquired. So there's a unique, General Giap talks about the acquisition of weapons from the enemy, the capture of weapons. Che Guevara talked about that as well on guerrilla warfare. This is somewhat different and unique in the Palestinian case in this war, in the sense that, as John Elmer has said on this channel and on the Electronic Intifada live streams, this is a indigenous capacity of manufacture, and they've made videos about how they manufacture these weapons inside of Gaza in their underground factories. So this is something that we've talked about on this channel before, which is that there's an approach, and although much is made, I think more is made of the idea that Iran is pulling the strings of the Palestinian resistance. It's not really how it works, but Iran and the Palestinian resistance, and of course Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria, the Syrian regime, they're all in an alliance. They're all different groups, and now the so-called Houthis or Ansar Allah in Yemen, they're all in an alliance, and that alliance has an approach to military affairs. And the approach to military affairs taken by Iran, which is the big sponsor, the big power here compared to the others, which are smaller, is not to fight the war on behalf of their allies, and it's not to sell weapons to their allies, or not solely to do that, or to provide them for free, whatever. The approach is to help their allies develop an indigenous weapons industry, a military industrial complex suited to their situation. And that's how the Palestinians have gone in several decades from one type of, from a rocket that can go hundreds of feet to a rocket that can reach Tel Aviv from Gaza, right? As again, this is John Elmer mentioned this in the EI live stream earlier today, but also that's why the iconic image of Palestinian resistance was 20 years ago was of a child throwing a stone at a tank, and there's a very famous image of a kid throwing a stone at a tank that was killed. And it's like an image of resistance and defiance, but it's also a very upsetting image. It's a very tragic image when you think of what happened to that kid, what the reward for facing that tank was. Now, 20 years later, they have produced, Palestinian resistance factions have produced through their own indigenous military industrial complex a rocket propelled grenade system that actually destroys tanks. And so they're producing videos of people going out, attacking a tank with one of these systems, and then leaving to living to tell the tale. So there's an evolution over time from a show of defiance to an asymmetric warfare, to an increasingly symmetric parody of warfare, where it's a guerrilla war. Of course, the Palestinians don't have armor, they don't have an air force, but they do have the ability to destroy Israeli tanks now and armored personnel carriers, and they can fight Israeli infantry when those infantry invade. So, okay, now I want to stop for today with a couple of strategic points on where this could go, because the Israeli army has hundreds upon hundreds of tanks, hundreds upon hundreds of armored vehicles. I don't know, 1,200 tanks or 1,500 tanks, main battle tanks, and probably the same number of fighting vehicles. They could produce them. Certainly, their air force, there's nothing, the Palestinians have no answer for the aerial bombardment against their civilians. They can continue to do that, to drop the 2,000-pound bombs on refugee camps and agglomerations of people in churches and houses and apartment blocks and hospitals, and proudly wear that as a badge of honor. And the guerrillas will not be able to do anything about that. There's no, and that's partly because of the way air defense works. Air defense is very complicated and expensive, and it's not really a guerrilla option as far as I understand. I think Iran probably has decent air defense. Air defense is not just missile systems, it's also radars. So if you take the radars out, the rest of the system doesn't work. And when you engage the system, it exposes the radars, which is why also Syria, for example, which has some air defense, will often allow Israel to bomb areas rather than engage their air defense, which will allow Israel to figure out and target their air defense specifically. So there's a whole game between aerial bombardment and air defense, which the Palestinian resistance just can't even play. they have to just accept that Israel's going to bomb their civilians in massive numbers, 25,000 or so now, the majority of whom are children. The ground operations of Israel, the Israeli army specifically, seem to be targeting children as well. And as I move towards more update type updates, I'll talk about day-to-day events as well. I just wanted to kind of give you a set of things to think about. And there's a couple of other final thoughts that I wanted to leave you with. One is, there's a quote by Napoleon: "In war, the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1." And if what I see in terms of what Israel is doing on the ground, in terms of what they're rounding up people and stripping them to their underwear and putting them in mass, concentration camp type environments, when you see snipers at churches and hospitals bulldozing patients in the courtyard of a hospital, and the way that these are all boasted about and praised in not just Israeli but pro-Israel social media. In fact, before I catch and delete them, I imagine even in the comments of this video there will be people who come to praise those acts. But I think smashing some of the ones that stay with me, like smashing the blackboard and the awards in a classroom that they invaded, or blowing up the courthouse. There's so many things, but these acts and the celebration of these acts, the planting of evidence in incubators, or the planting of copies of Hitler's book, and always saying that they found it in a child's room to specifically justify violence against children. The culmination of all of these acts and the celebration of these acts has to be debilitating on morale, ultimately, on military morale, because you lose a sense of what you're fighting for. You lose a sense of who you're fighting, and you lose a meaningful cause behind what you're doing. And I don't see it happening right now. It doesn't appear to be happening, but I think it will. I don't think that you can celebrate this type of act constantly, socially, and continue to function as a cohesive society, continue to have trust in one another, when there's these kinds of depraved actions taking place and being celebrated on a daily basis. I mean, it's a hypothesis, but behind the hypothesis is, when you consider thousands of years of martial traditions going back to the ancient times, there have always been atrocities in war. There's always been horrible atrocities in war. There's also always been codes of containing these atrocities, codes of regulating how militaries behave, warriors' honor, all of these ideas. That's also gone in parallel with the atrocities. And so the attempts to codify this in law, in international law or Geneva Conventions, of course, has been, I guess the major powers have thumbed their nose at it since I mean, and there's always been one standard for colonial wars and a different standard for Clausewitzian wars between European powers. But the complete discarding of all of this and the celebration of the discarding of all of this, it suggests that, like, either there is going to be consequences for that, either there's going to be a moral collapse or a moral damage done to the Israeli military and its ability to perform, or thousands of years of martial codes trying to restrain what you could do to your enemies on the battlefield have all been put in place for no reason. I'm not sure if I explained that right, but those are the two possibilities. Either these codes of honor and codes of conduct in military affairs were put there for some good reason, namely so that the military could be a part of society that protected society, and society continued to function as per, again, Giap's manual is a good example. He talks a lot about how guerrillas are supposed to conduct themselves. Che Guevara, of course, as well. Or um or those things were frivolous. All those codes and laws of war were just frivolous, and we never needed them, and so the mighty were always going to just do whatever they felt like and have no consequences to themselves because they had the power in that moment. So I don't know. I don't know which of those two it's going to be, but I have my suspicions about it. The last thought before I go for today is actually I have two more, just to answer two things that I keep seeing. And what the first one is related to what I was just talking about, codes of war, laws of war, etc. Because remember that this genocide is taking place with a biblical justification. It's a specific reading of the Bible. I've been talking about it on my Substack. If you read my Substack, I have a essay from a couple of Substacks ago called Amalek, and it's about the biblical justification for this genocidal type of war, because there are passages in the Bible, in Joshua, the book of Joshua, and there was a reading group, a Ben Gurion reading group on the book of Joshua, apparently. Ben Gurion and some notables in the 50s read the book of Joshua together. And in that book, God says, the children of Amalek, you destroy them, all their children, their women, their livestock, everything. You destroy everything. And there's a book about this specific type of warfare and the biblical justifications for violence. And the author kind of talks about how Christians, it's for a Christian audience, how Christians have to confront these passages, and it's better to try to understand them in context and not take them to mean justification for genocide. But the analysis is that the author of that book, and again, it's mentioned in my a couple of Substacks ago, if you check that out, the author says this is particularly scary because you can't surrender if you're deemed harem, if you're deemed Amalek. Surrendering won't save you. The idea is that all women, all children, all livestock, all men, everybody must be destroyed. And that is what Netanyahu has called the Palestinians, Amalek. That is what many politicians and soldiers have been using. They've been writing it on places in Gaza that they've seized, buildings, writing it on shells that they've shot to explode on Palestinians. So all of which is to set up the point that when you see on Twitter or wherever, well, Hamas should just surrender then. I think Blinken said it, Hamas should just surrender then. This could end if Hamas surrenders. In fact, it wouldn't end if Hamas surrendered, because Netanyahu and Israel has decided that Palestinians are Amalek, and Canada supports that, and the US supports that, the whole West supports that. So there is no honesty behind people saying Hamas should just surrender, because Israel would not accept Hamas's surrender, because they are pursuing a war of religious, biblical Amalek, biblically justified genocide. That is my second last point. And my final point was something that Mearsheimer said, Professor Mearsheimer. And Mearsheimer is also, he's known, in case you don't know him, he's a political scientist. He's a realist. He's been doing a lot of lectures in the past couple of years, because he was trying to argue that the proxy war sponsoring the Ukraine side in the Russia-Ukraine war was not a good idea, that Ukraine could not win, that the result would be the destruction of Ukraine, and that it would ultimately be bad for the West as well. And that's what he was saying about that. And I've been listening to him on Gaza. I mean, the ironic thing is, there's huge, he's a theorist on how America should do imperialism better in some ways. I don't know whether he identifies as an imperialist, but I think he talks about US foreign policy, and he uses the term we. So it's not exactly an anti-imperialist perspective from Professor Mearsheimer. He thinks that American power is being squandered in adventures that are not appropriate for it, and that America should really be conserving its power for the confrontation with China. I believe. I don't know if he's said that exactly or directly. I think I have heard him say things like that. But anyway, this is not someone who can be dismissed. It's someone who you have to study, and you have to understand. I would say, at the very least. Mearsheimer on Gaza, he's been talking a lot about Gaza, Palestine, Israel, and he said something like there are no existential threats to Israel, and Hezbollah is very weak. Hezbollah being the Lebanese guerrilla force that's allied with the Palestinian resistance, that's fighting Israel on the border right now. And of course, Hamas is very weak, and so on. And Iran will not be entering a war with Israel unless they want to be destroyed themselves. So I wouldn't call that a defeatist perspective. It's not really how he sees the world. His point was that it's not an existential threat to Israel. And what I see is, when I ask myself, why is Israel continuing on this path? This is somewhat difficult to understand, in the sense that they've taken more casualties than they've ever taken in these recurrent wars with Gaza that they've had since 2006. They've taken many more casualties. Their military vehicles are being destroyed, in several every day. Ambushes. There are videos of traumatized veterans, Israeli soldiers coming back. You can look for a speech of a traumatized Israeli soldier making a speech in the Israeli Knesset. And in all previous wars, they've withdrawn after a fraction of the casualties. Now, what happened on October 7th, I've written about that on Substack. There's plenty of material on Electronic Intifada. Max Blumenthal on the Gray Zone has written a lot about what happened on October 7th. And maybe I'll make a separate video just about that, or with Elmer, we'll see. But of course, October 7th has some special significance in making the Israeli military and society continuously want to keep going, um, regardless of losses that they may be taking. My my what I would what I would my reflection on what Mearsheimer says is that within almost any borders, and especially uh, the 1967 borders, I think Israel could very much have been secure forever. Um, but the constant expansionist um, warfare, the constant, detailed humiliations of the siege and the blockade of Gaza, which, if you're new to all of that, I'd be happy to follow that up. We can talk about that in future videos. There's plenty of material about it. All of that, none of that intrinsically poses a threat either. We've seen how determined the West is to continue to support Israel through all of these months of atrocities and future months of atrocities to come. So I don't disagree exactly, but what is happening now with Israeli society, with this commitment to revenge, with the latest poll showing that 98% of Israelis do not believe that Israel has used too much firepower in Gaza, with the complete support for everything that Israel is doing in Gaza, the Israeli Air Force is doing, and seeing, because the Israelis see. I don't know how much Westerners see. I don't. I've lost a lot of illusions about what Western elites, especially, are moved by or can be moved by. But that is what it is. But Israelis are seeing what their Air Force is doing to the Palestinian civilians and Palestinian children, and they're utterly unmoved by it. So the question is, where does how does a society like that evolve? Long term or medium term, where does that go? If they succeed, just game it out for a while. Imagine they succeed in displacing a couple of million Palestinians into the Sinai. There's already a war going on in the West Bank now. Right? They're going to imagine they succeed in displacing everyone to Jordan. Are they then going to move Israelis up to the borders of those countries and then start attacking those countries, the Palestinian refugee camps in those countries, since that's what already happened once, with Gaza and the West Bank being areas from which Palestinian refugees of the current Israel borders are displaced from, and Lebanon. So the continuous fighting with Palestinians wherever they are, and the genocidal urge, the biblical justification, the unconditional support from the West, it means that, and of course, the United Nations uselessness, the International Criminal Court, these are the International Criminal Court and the United Nations complicity are both elements of unconditional support in the West. But what then happens to such a society? Where does that go? How does that evolve? Because it seems to me that it just keeps going until it's stopped somehow. And while it continues on this constant course of confrontation and destruction of Palestinian civilians, children, wherever they are, displaced from northern Gaza into southern Gaza, maybe displaced into the desert, displaced from their homes in the West Bank, Jerusalem, into other camps, into Jordan. The Israelis will then attack them too. There will always be more groups of indigenous people who want to come home that have to be continuously attacked. And as the resistance gets, if you watch the trend that the resistance is on, the ability to maintain technological supremacy or military supremacy, especially in a guerrilla context where moral is to the material as 3 to 1, maybe more. It's a very unstable and very dangerous situation. So these are all some long-term considerations. That's the considerations of sources, considerations of how to think about it, or how I'm thinking about it militarily. And when I come back for other sit reps, I will do more sit rep type things. We'll see how this one does, and if people find it valuable, I'll do more.